Well, Jack, thank you for that introduction, and all my neighbors down in Oregon. Thank you for the invitation to talk to you. As Jack mentioned, I'm a geologist by background and training, but what I want to talk to you about tonight is the importance of soil, the stuff that covers up rocks. Because over the course of the last 15 years or so, I've done a lot of work in looking at the relationship of how of people and the land viewed through the lens of how the way people treat the soil affects people in the future. And that's led me to write four books, two of which I co-authored with my wife, Anne Baclay, who is a biologist. And when you think about soil, geology and biology put together, that's essentially what you make soil out of. Um, and what I want to share with you tonight is sort of the overview of this series of four books, culminating in What Your Food Ate, because they all integrate together, and it really illustrates the learning process that Ann and I went through in researching these books. Because the book that I wrote first, was essentially a problem statement. It looks at how human societies have treated the land in the past and how that has played out in terms of the fates of their descendants. And the executive summary of that is that societies that don't treat their soil well don't tend to last. Um, the Hidden Half of Nature, the second book in this series of four books, well, the first one that I wrote with Anne, is what you might think of as a cure. It dives into the science behind microbial ecology, both in garden settings and also in the human gut, to look at what is it that makes for fertile soil and what do microbes have to do with it, and how those tiny organisms really support the health of the world, the macroscopic world that we know in our everyday lives and in our own bodies and gardens. The Growing Revolution, the third book in this set of four books, really looked at how to take the science from the hidden half of nature and apply it to solving the problem I laid out in dirt, to look at how regenerative farming practices can rebuild healthy, fertile soils on farmland around the world without compromising yields. In other words, a different way to think about farming. And the most recent book, What Your Food Ate, really illustrates, we think, the stakes for people and for human health, and basically asks the question of, do healthy soils translate into healthier people? What's the relationship between the health of the land and the healthfulness, if you will, of the food that we get from it, and how that can help support our bodies or not? So let me dive into it. We're going to start with the background from dirt, and looking at the problem of soil degradation today. It's a global problem. This is the UN's map of global soil degradation. You notice there's a lot of red on the map. Don't pay too much attention to all the details, but just note that there's that red area, the area of fairly degraded soils, are areas where, to maintain high crop yields, we absolutely depend on synthetic fertilizers at this point, because we've degraded the natural fertility of the land. And something like a third of the world's potential agricultural land has already been taken out of agricultural production, due to degradation from tillage, in effect. Is what is it that has led to widespread soil degradation and erosion in regions around the world? An awful lot of it comes from the plow. What is it that the plow did? Its invention dramatically increased the pace of soil erosion on our agricultural lands. And how does that work? Well, how many places have you ever been in a natural grassland or forest where there's like vast stretches of bare earth? You don't tend to see that naturally. Nature tends to clothe herself in plants. And there's strong, compelling reasons we went into in the hidden half of nature about how that evolved, in terms of plants producing organic matter, which makes the soil fertile, which helps you grow more plants. What does the plow do? It undoes that. It leaves the land vulnerable to erosion by water or wind, um, for as long as it takes for something else to grow in the site, whether it's a weed or the next crop. And one can literally erode off a century's worth of soil building in an afternoon rainfall if the land is freshly plowed and bare and vulnerable to erosion. This is part of the story that I unearthed in researching the dirt book. That problem has plagued many societies in the past, and it continues to plague agriculture today. As one of the things that I did in researching dirt was to essentially document how fast farms are eroding globally in the world today. And I did that by not going out and measuring erosion on every farm in the world, obviously, but instead by going to the library, and finding all the data I could find on how fast the world's farmlands are eroding. And I compiled something like 1,400 different studies that looked at how fast conventional agriculture, conventional tillage, plow-based agriculture, is eroding soils around the world. And the average rate was about an inch every 20 years. That's about a millimeter a year. Your fingernails grow faster than that. Only a geologist would think that was a really fast rate. But for soil, That's a screamingly fast rate. Why? Because it takes nature 500 to 1,000 years to remake that inch of soil that we can lose in a couple decades of modern farming. And as long as you're losing, as long as you're losing something faster than you're replacing it, you're literally running out of it. But I'm not arguing that we're going to run out of soil in any time in the near future. But I am arguing that the problem of soil degradation could compromise our ability to continue to grow as much food as we've been growing in the past. How has this played out in the past? I could show you society after society from the research for the Dirt Book. I'll just show you this one example from the southeastern region of the United States. It's the Piedmont or hill country from Virginia up here in the upper right down to Alabama in the lower left. That gray noodle is the hill country, so it's not the coastal plain and not the rocky spine of the Appalachians, but the Piedmont was really good agricultural land when European farmers first started clearing the land to grow crops in the region. It became one of the breadbaskets of the early North American colonies. What this map shows you, however, is the extent of soil loss over the last couple hundred years since colonial farming arrived in the region. And you'll notice that there's a lot of gray, so 4 to 10 inches of soil lost across this entire region. The black areas are areas where more than 10 inches have been lost. How much soil was there in the first place? How big a deal is this? If you go back and you read the journals of some of the original of the early European farmers and plantation owners in this region, they wrote about having 6 inches or so of rich black earth over a fairly sterile subsoil. Well, farmers across this region today are essentially farming that subsoil. The topsoil is pretty much gone. And if you could think about, if we could shed the topsoil off of a pretty big region that was a major breadbasket in the early North American colonies and do it in just a couple hundred years, imagine what the Greeks and the Romans could have done with a 1,000-year run at their upland hilly landscapes in Greece or central Italy. It puts into perspective the idea that soil degradation is something that can catch up with societies. Now, what does that look like? This is a pair of soils from a farm in that gray noodle I just showed you in North Carolina. The one on the screen right, the khaki one, is one from a conventional tobacco plantation where it's been cultivated conventionally for about 100, 150 years. You'll notice that it looks like California beach sand. It looks it's not very dark. That soil on the left is much darker. It has lots of organic matter in it. These samples were collected literally across the fence line from each other, and what's different between them is not the geology. They're derived from the same deposits, and that they are 10-million-year-old beach sands, so that there's a reason it looks like beach sand. But the difference in the color is organic matter. So what's different from the one on the left? This was from a farm that was abandoned back in the 19th century when its land was degraded, and it's been recovering for 150 years. The only difference here, in other words, is how people have treated the land for the last century or so. And I've yet to meet a farmer or gardener who would rather be working this dead khaki dirt than this more chocolate brown soil. And the difference in color, that's carbon. Soil organic matter is roughly 50% carbon, más or menos, and you can describe differences in soil color typically, particularly with this dark chocolate hues to dark blacks. That's organic matter. Light colors don't have much in it. And that farm is not atypical for American agriculture. There's a paper in the journal Sustainability a few years back that looked at soil degradation across North America and concluded that the soil organic matter content of many of the agricultural soils of North America is only about 50%. They're half of the level now than they were when they were first converted from forests or prairies into farmlands. In other words, we've degraded the soil organic matter by about half on lots of the farmland around the U.S. And there was just a study that came out last year from one of my graduate students that looked at the soil loss from the Corn Belt across the upper Midwest in the U.S. that documented that about 1/3 of the area had lost pretty much all its topsoil at this point, just like the American Southeast. This problem of soil degradation is not just one of soil loss, but it's also one of the loss of soil organic matter. And what are the two basic practices that contribute to that in modern farming that regenerative farming, as we'll get to, can undo? It's the reliance on heavy routine tillage and the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. What does routine tillage do? Well, as you might imagine from this slide that's on the screen now, this field on the right is an organic farm down in California, freshly plowed and dressed up, waiting for the starts to be put in. But imagine what would happen if it rained on that field. It's going to look like what we've all seen running off of construction sites every now and then, just brown runoff carrying soil away. And routine tillage not only can result in soil loss, but it can degrade soil organic matter. Why? It oxidizes the soil, it stimulates bacteria to break down the organic matter, as does synthetic nitrogen. It in turn stimulates soil life, bacteria in particular, to break down the organic matter in the soil that actually is the font of fertility. And so these two basic mainstays of modern conventional farming really contribute to the long-term soil degradation that has plagued past societies. They didn't obviously have nitrogen fertilizers, but they sure had plows. And as I got to the end of writing dirt, I was wrestling with the question of, can we actually reverse the historical pattern of soil degradation? Um, and if so, how fast might we be able to do it? Because if it takes centuries to millennia to rebuild soils after we degrade them in, that's not a terribly policy relevant time frame. But this ends the depressing part of this talk, because what I learned in writing these 4 books with Anne was that we can restore soils, and we can do it remarkably fast enough to actually impress a politician, perhaps, certainly fast enough to contribute to helping with the climate crisis, and definitely fast enough to try and reverse the progress of soil degradation this century. How did I learn to be an optimist on this issue? Well, a lot of it started in our own yard, in my wife's garden, because she actually is I don't think she's technically a master gardener in terms of being certified, but she's a master full gardener in terms of what she does. And one of the things that she did when we bought a house in North Seattle after I got tenure at the University of Washington is it came with soil that looked like this on the left. She turned it into soil like that on the right. She turned essentially pretty sterile dirt into healthy, fertile soil. That's what started getting me into the realm of optimism. And that led Anne and I to write The Hidden Half of Nature, about her experience in the garden and the parallels with what goes on in the human gut, what we think of as a cure for the problems that I've just been describing that have plagued past societies and that continue to plague society today in terms of soil degradation. So this is the house that we bought in North Seattle. Back when we bought it, you'll notice this side yard was just an old growth lawn. It's about 6 inches of tangled roots. Pretty much nothing else in the yard. Anne thought it was a blank slate to make the garden she'd always dreamed about having, until we pulled that lawn off and we found that we had crap soil. We forgot to dig a soil pit when we bought the house. We didn't think to look under the hood of the yard. And when we pulled that lawn off to start making the garden that Anne was really wanting had always dreamed of making, we had soil like that North Carolina tobacco field. Khaki soil, not a single worm crawled out of this soil when we pulled the lawn off, had less than 1% organic matter, and realized that we had the mineral part of what makes healthy soil, but what we were lacking was the biology. We were lacking the organic matter and the life that feeds on that organic matter. So she got a wheelbarrow, painted it up with the help of a template from some friendly guys at an auto body shop, and started bringing organic matter into our site, layering wood chips onto the soil, coffee grounds, zoodoo from the Seattle Zoo, which is exactly what you might imagine zoodoo would be, the composted herbivore manure. And within a couple years, we're starting to see an actual soil develop. This is a pit that we dug, I think, about 3 years into all of her composting and mulching, where you still see that basically the dead subsoil that we had at the surface when we broke ground at the bottom, but you have a couple inches of fairly good soil there starting. And over the course of about 10 years, she built about a foot of really rich, healthy organic matter, and the garden blossomed and prospered. Life returned to the land, both below ground and above ground. And we write about the interesting sequence of how it came back in The Hidden Half of Nature. It paralleled the evolution of life on Earth. And when we restored fertility to the soil, it basically reassembled an ecosystem from the ground up. And not just for our enjoyment, but Anne had quite the vegetable garden with kale that basically we had kale plants that lived for 6-7 years and kept producing in this really fertile soil that she built in the yard with compost and mulch. What we got interested in was how it worked. What was it that was actually driving this process of soil restoration? How was it working that we were putting, layering compost and mulch on the soil? We didn't do much digging in, really not much, not any. And the soil really started to darken and to become enriched in organic matter. And the key was exudates. What are exudates? They are things that plants exude out of their roots. So what goes on in the rhizosphere, which is literally Greek for zone around the roots of a plant, is integral to building soil fertility and for, it turns out, the health and nutrition of crops and people in the end. We all know that green vegetation will capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, merge it with water that's brought up through its roots to, in the process of photosynthesis, to build carbohydrates that build the bodies of plants. But very few of us learned in college that that plants also exude out of their roots 20%, 30%, some even north of 40% of what they manage to fix through photosynthesis, they'll exude it out of their roots into the soil. And what are the kind of compounds they're exuding into the soil? Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, fats. What's that sound like? That sounds like food, doesn't it? Basically, plants are exuding food into the soil, and they're not doing it just to be wasteful. They're doing it to feed life in the soil. It's essentially a botanical strategy for recruiting um, uh, microbial allies in the rhizosphere that do things that benefit the health of the plant. So if you zoom in around the zone, a single root tip, and look at what's happening there, plants are releasing exudates into the soil. They don't make it very far, about a millimeter to a centimeter, the thickness or length of your thumbnail, roughly, into the soil before something eats them. Because it's kind of like if you leave pizza out in a college campus, students arrive. You want students to come to your event, advertise free pizza. It'll be a sellout. That's what's happening in the rhizosphere. Plants are basically setting a subterranean buffet for life that comes to it and consumes those exudates. And what does any organism do with what it consumes? It metabolizes it. And the metabolites that bacteria in the soil produce, for example, include things like plant growth promoting hormones. And when Ann and I read papers documenting how plant exudates were feeding soil bacteria that made plant growth promoting hormones right around the tips of the roots of a plant, where the root plant could take it back up, grow bigger, spread bigger solar panels, capture more carbon dioxide to build more carbohydrates, share more exudates of soil life, we realize that there's a biological bazaar happening right beneath our feet in a garden or on a farm, where soil life is really in partnership with the plants, where the plants you can think of as solar panels that are helping to feed an underground community that does other things, including what, say, fungi will do in terms of fetching mineral elements out of soil particles, acting like miniature miners and truckers that then bring those materials back and give it to the plant in exchange for a cut of those exudates. Those kinds of symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationships turn out to be the backbone of soil fertility, and it's something that is greatly undermined by conventional farming practices. Because we can think of the soil as having a diet. You think of the soil as the external diet for plants. Plants outsource their stomach into the rhizosphere. Where essentially the digestion of rocks, what plants eat ultimately, happens, and it's soil life that helps to facilitate that process. So we can think about soils as having two different diets. There's the fertilizer diet, where we know that with large enough applications of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, we can grow healthy crops in even fairly degraded soils. So organic matter poor soils can produce high crop yields if given enough fertilizer, but the plants don't tend to invest much in their roots when they're spoon-fed all they need to grow big. The question of whether they grow healthy is a different question, because when plants don't invest in their root system, they're not investing in as much in producing exudates, and that means they're not getting as many of the beneficial micronutrients that soil life would provide, or the beneficial microbial metabolites from microbes metabolizing those exudates. The soil health diet is a different way to think about how a plant eats, where a plant growing in healthy, life-filled, fertile soil will invest a lot in its root system, and because it then gets a return from life in the soil, and so you can get high yields and high crop health with the soil health diet. Now, Ann and I think it's no coincidence that the global sales of pesticides went through the roof in the decades after global sales of synthetic fertilizers. Nitrogen in particular went through the roof. Why? Because the fertilizer diet undermines a crop's natural defensive undermines crop health and the natural defensive systems. And how does it do that? Well, it limits the supply of mineral micronutrients. What kind of things? Well, like iron and zinc and selenium, elements that plants need to be healthy, but they don't need a lot of it. I mean, we need them as well to be healthy, but we don't need a lot of them. That's why they're called micronutrients. They're important, but you don't need a lot, but you need that little bit, an awful lot. So plants that are heavily fertilized with nitrogen in particular tend not to take up as much in the way of mineral micronutrients. And the details are all in the hidden half of nature and also in What's Your Food Date. Um, Plants on a fertilizer diet will also not invest as much in making phytochemicals. Now, what are phytochemicals? Phytochemicals, well, they're in the name. Phyto is plant and chemical is a chemical, so it's a chemical made by a plant. And we tend to use that term for a special class of compounds that plants make for their own physiologic benefit. Those are things like linalool. That's the molecule that gives lavender its distinctive scent. So if you're into aromatherapy, with lavender, a linalool is sort of the key phytochemical there. Sulforaphane is a phytochemical in the brassicas, cauliflowers, and broccoli, and so on, that it has demonstrated anti-cancer properties in the human diet. Curcumin is the active ingredient in turmeric, also known to have active anti-cancer properties in the human diet. But plants don't make phytochemicals for our benefit, even if it does benefit us to eat plants that are rich, crops that are rich in phytochemicals. Plants make phytochemicals for their own purposes. And that can be summarized here in terms of communication. Plants do have an active communication and language, but it's not one that we can understand. It's a chemical one. Sort of a call and response with chemical exudates serve as messages that go out into the soil that can do things like recruit. They can trigger plants to make phytochemicals in response that can fend off insect pests or pathogens. For example, if an insect herbivore nibbles on a plant, there's some plants that will put exudates out through their roots that will attract a particular microbe that in turn will produce a metabolite that will stimulate that plant to then make a phytochemical that tastes bad to that insect and sends the bug off to eat some other plant. Other phytochemicals plants make for their own protection. The beta carotene that gives carrots and squash the orange kind of color is also a very good sunscreen. You'll find it actually on labels for sunscreens that we use. So plants make phytochemicals for their own purposes. It's essentially the biological bazaar in the soil, all those symbiotic relationships between soil life and plants that help to build organic matter. That's essentially the botanical world's health plan. It's a world that was not all that apparent to us until just a few decades ago, but its importance looking forward to thinking about how we farm is immense. So when Ann and I sort of finished digging into, if you'll pardon the pun, the science behind the hidden half of nature, we're left with the question of, well, to what degree can applying that kind of science on farms actually lead to a reversal of the soil degradation that has plagued past societies? And that's what I wrote about in Growing a Revolution. It's more of the how-to book that looks at the differences between conventional agriculture, which really emphasizes agrochemistry as the dominant way to think about the soil. Think about soil as something to hold up the crops as we apply the fertilizers they need to grow big. And then we can contrast that with the regenerative agriculture that emphasizes cultivating soil life. It's the difference really between conventional and regenerative agriculture is sort of how one prioritizes the hierarchy of sciences in thinking about applications. And regenerative agriculture puts the biology first. Conventional agriculture really puts the chemistry and physics first. Chemistry and physics are important. There's no denying that they are totally important in soil fertility, but the biology is co-equal, and particularly through the biological bazaar that I was just describing. How does that work? Well, basically, I took about 6 months off from teaching here at UW to travel around the world and research Growing a Revolution and visit farmers who had done to their farms what Ann had done to our yard, and to look at I looked at the commonalities between farmers who'd been very successful at that, and they all shared sort of three basic practices that form the backbone of regenerative agriculture. And this is whether they were on a small subsistence farm in Africa or Central America or large North American farms. The farmers who had restored health and fertility to the land in a way that I'll show you in a moment all practiced minimal disturbance. So they didn't till, they didn't plow. They always kept the soil covered, which meant that they grew cover crops in between their cash crops, or always had the land covered with some kind of a growing crop to produce those exudates. And they grew diverse crop rotations. They didn't just grow corn and soybeans. They were growing 4, 5, 6 or more crops in a rotation, or very rich diversities of cover crops in between their cash crops. Some of them were also reintegrating animal husbandry into their operations in ways that actually accelerated soil building, in completely the opposite of the narrative one tends to hear around animal agriculture and soil and climate these days. Regenerative grazing practices can actually rebuild soil organic matter rather fast. And so what I found is that the general principles in these farms around the world translate to other settings. They tend to be fairly universal, of that minimal disturbance, cover crops, and diversity. But the specific practices need to be tailored to the specific setting. The farmers on um, small farms feeding a single family in Africa obviously use different practices than horizon to horizon operations in the Dakotas, but they operated following similar principles. What did it mean to their soil? Well, here's two soils from Ohio. They are from David Brandt's farm, one of the farmers I interviewed in Growing a Revolution. David's soil is this rich black earth over there on the left. The one on the right is his neighbor's soil, which is very much like the soil David started with when he started farming in the early 1970s. And he basically turned this kind of organic matter, poor dirt, less than 1% organic matter, into rich, fertile soil that had more carbon in it than the native soils from the forest that was there before his farm. So he completely restored fertility to his land, and he did it selling wheat, corn, and soybeans in the North American commodity crop markets, but he grew an incredible diversity of cover crops in between his cash crops. Another farm that's had similar kind of results is Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser's Singing Frogs farm in Northern California. They took soil that started out like this and turned it into soil about like this, rich black soil, and they did it in about 10 to 12 years with very intensive no-till vegetable farming. The third farm that I'll show you the difference in their soil on was Gabe Brown's farm in Bismarck, North Dakota. He actually took regenerative farming a step further to reintegrate animal husbandry onto his land. So he brings cows in to graze off his cover crops after he's grown a cash crop, and then he brings chickens in to eat the bugs that come out of the cow pies. And what did that do to his soil? This is the soil from that field that I just showed you, this incredibly rich black earth with more organic matter in it than the native prairie soils had, or comparable. And his neighbor's farm, which has pretty decent soil, but it still has half the organic matter content as Gabe's farm, and it took Gabe roughly 10 to 15 years to do it. Here's basically the game plan. That is how it played out on Gabe's farm. A slide I stole from his TED Talk with his permission. That essentially he started off with about 3 inches of topsoil back in 1993. And he went no-till, and he started out with less than 2% organic matter, about 1.7%. He then diversified his cash crops. He then added cover crops. He went to multi-species cover crops, and then he integrated livestock into his operation around 2010. And by then he had tripled his soil organic matter, gone from less than 2% to 6%. And his soil had gone from, his topsoil had gone from 3 inches in depth to 14 inches in depth. This is really totally parallel to what Ann did to our yard, but Gabe did it on a large, commercially viable and highly profitable farm. This is why I started to turn into an optimist on regenerative agriculture. And Clara Kahn and Jonathan Lundgren put a paper out a year after Growing a Revolution that really confirmed the findings in terms of the economics, which is what started me really getting into the optimist zone, where they compared the annual revenue and cost per hectare for conventional and regenerative farms that were, I think, about 20 farms in each category across the corn belt in the upper Midwest. And the way you read this graph is that what the farmers harvested off the land in terms of dollars per hectare is the top of the bar. What they spent to do it is all the colors. So the white bar at the bottom is the profit that's left over. And you'll notice that the regenerative farmers spent a lot less. They spent less on seeds, they spent less on herbicide, they spent less on fertilizer by a long way. They were not organic farmers, but they were farming along with these the practices that I mentioned earlier, and they did it in ways that greatly reduced their fertilizer and diesel use, and that left them more of their profit, that left them more profit in the end. This is what started me really thinking that these ideas could catch on, because if it's more profitable for farmers, more of them are going to be more likely to use it. So what are some of the benefits of healthy soil? Higher farmer profits, less fertilizer use, less pesticide use, less fossil fuel use, and comparable yields. And that combination of spending less to grow as much results in higher profits. It also results in off-farm benefits for the rest of us. More carbon and water in the soil, more carbon in the soil, all the changes in color that I showed you the soils, that's carbon. There's a carbon-rich soil can better retain water, and more of the rain that falls on it will sink into the ground instead of running off, which helps with drought resilience for crops. And it also can result in less offsite pollution, because the single best way to cut down on the nitrate and phosphate pollution from over-fertilizing farms is to use less of it in the first place. So there's lots of benefits for thinking about that rebuilding healthy soils provide, but what are the stakes? What does it mean for what gets into our diet? I've shown you so far mostly things that relate to the health of the land, but what does healthy soil mean in terms of the health of people? Does it change what gets into our diet, and does it do it in enough ways that matter? So one of the things that Ann and I did in writing What Your Food Ate was to do the study that we couldn't find out there actually in the scientific literature, which was a direct comparison of growing the same crops in healthy soils and degraded soils that were the same soil type, growing the same crop in the same area. So we did a study where we took 10 paired farms across the United States, had them grow the same crop on a regenerative farm and a neighboring conventional farm, and we compared both soil health, and also we did some nutritional analysis of what was grown on those farms. So the map up here shows you the farms that we looked at across the U.S., sort of 10 farms across the U.S. from California to Connecticut. And the little bar graphs here down to the little box and whisker plots in the lower left-hand corner show you the differences in the soil. And percent soil organic matter is the one on the left. The blue data are from the regenerative farms. The red data are from the conventional farms. What you'll notice is that the regenerative farms have more soil organic matter. On average, about twice as much, from 3% up to 6%. And in terms of soil health, which is a test called the Haney test that integrates not only soil organic matter, but also microbial activity. So it's measurements of microbial respiration, how active the microbes are, as a gross sense of just what's going on in the soil. And you notice that the regenerative farms had 3 times the soil health score as the conventional farms. And we looked at these as ratios as well, but this is just the raw data all compiled together. And and these regenerative farms had only been practicing regenerative farming with the full suite of 3 things: no-till, cover crops, and diversity, for between 5 and 10 years. And to rebuild soil health that rapidly really got my attention, because that's faster than any geological textbook will tell you that soils are made. Turns out that if you have the mineral part of soils and you just need to bring the life back to it, you can do the biology restoration actually quite fast. So what difference did it make to what was actually in the crops? We had those farmers, they looked at, they submitted cabbage, corn, peas, sorghum, or soy, depending on which one they grew on their farms. And what we found is that the phytochemicals, carotenoids, phenolics, and phytosterols were 15 to 20% higher in the regenerative farms. Some vitamin micronutrients were 15 to 30% higher as well. The soil health scores I just went over, they were 30% higher to 2.5 times higher. In other words, the healthier soils led to more phytochemicals and more micronutrients and phytochemicals in foods. And the Bionutrient Association is continuing to do some really impressive work on this with much larger sample sizes, and they're seeing results that really back up and emphasize what we were talking about. So based on our literature research for What Your Food Ate and the study that I was just describing, and I identified sort of four basic things that we like to call the Fab Four, of things in foods that farming practices definitely impact in ways that impact human health. And those things are micronutrient abundance, as I was just showing you. It's also the fat balance in animals, as I'll get into, the amount of phytochemicals in crops, and the amount of microbial metabolites in crops. And so there's these connections between soil health influencing crop health, which then also gets into the things that will influence our health and the health of livestock. Because it turns out that when we think about animal agriculture, there's another biological bazaar going on in the rumen of cows. It's kind of like, it's kind of like our colon that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature, but it's also um, uh, um, it's also parallel to what's going on in the rhizosphere, around the roots of a plant. It's just, you can think of that as inside out. The cows bring material into their bodies to break it down, whereas most plants are subsidizing life outside of their bodies in the soil to break it down. And so what do cows eat? Well, they eat leafy greens, they eat plants, and it turns out that the plants are full of what Ann and I like to call the fats of the land, the omega-3 and omega-6 fats. It turns out that living and leafy plants, greens, tend to be rich in omega-3s. Why? Because omega-3s are involved in photosynthesis, so the green parts of plants have them. Omega-6s tend to be rich in seeds. Why? Because it's a molecule that's less reactive than omega-3s, and tends to be very well suited for storage, which is the job of seeds, storing energy until the plant's ready to germinate. So it turns out that when we'll talk about cows for the most part, but when ruminants, or any ruminants, graze, if they're grazing on grasses or prairie vegetation, they tend to get a rough balance of omega-6s and omega-3s. They get enough omega-3s in their diet, whereas when they are fed a grain-based diet or grain-based rations, like cows are fed in feedlots, they're eating basically the products of parts of plants that had no leaves. They're basically eating an omega-6 rich diet. And they get overloaded with omega-6s, and that can lead to health problems in cows in feedlots, as we talk about in What Your Food Ate. But it also translates into differences in our diet. Cows will also can take in phytochemicals, which it turns out there was just a study about health promoting phytonutrients or phytochemicals in grass-fed meat and milk that turned out to be that the synthesized 22 studies of pasture versus concentrate or seed-based diets in cows in dairy and meat. And what they found was that in terms of phytochemicals, the carotenoids, tocopherols, polyphenols, and terpenoids, they're anywhere from 2 to 20-fold higher in grass-fed meat and dairy. So grass-fed meat and dairy, the balance of fats and the amount of phytochemicals in what livestock eat turns out to be essential components of the ruminant health plan. And that the fat balance and a good phytochemical load from a healthy diet for cows translates into health of the cows, which we wrote about in What Your Food Ate. It also translates into the human diet, because that balance of fats, whether it's things are overloaded in omega-6s or rich in omega-3s, and whether they have lots of phytochemicals or not, that comes right through from meat and dairy products into our diet. So we should be concerned with what it is our livestock are eating. For those of us who eat meat and dairy products, a very important concern is what was the diet of that food? Essentially, what did your food eat? So that brings us to the final bit that I'm going to talk about, which is the connection to people. Because there was a big change in people in the public health in the mid-20th century, when if we look at the incidence of infectious diseases, they tended to drop through the second half of the 20th century, whereas the incidence of immune disorders and chronic diseases went through the roof in the second half of the 20th century. There was a big dietary change right around 1950 when we shifted towards a conventional diet that has all the issues that I've been discussing so far. And these conventional diseases really took off as our diet changed in the late 20th century, to the point where now 7 out of 10 Americans suffer from at least one chronic illness. And most of those chronic illnesses can be traced to having roots in diet and inflammation. What is it about diet and inflammation that is relevant to what I've been talking about so far? Well, when we think about inflammation in our diet, the first thing to think about is that inflammation is not always bad. You know, if you cut your finger in the kitchen on a knife, you want inflammation to start attacking the microbes that are burrowing into your finger from that cut. But you want inflammation to stop once it's no longer useful to your body. And it turns out that there are certain fats that start and maintain inflammation. So if we look at sort of a cycle of inflammation here, with time running to the right and just the magnitude of inflammation running up the y-axis, in the inflammation will tend to start, and then at some point you want it to end and resolve. Chronic inflammation is what happens when you don't resolve and inflammation stays at high levels or increases. Certain fats tend to start inflammation, other fats tend to end it. And you might be able to guess where I'm going with this. It turns out that it's the omega-6 fats that initiate and maintain inflammation, and it's the omega-3 fats that really act to terminate and end inflammation. Now, how does this play out? Well, it turns out that then the balance of omega-3s and omega-6s in a person's diet turns out to be part of a person's health plan, for better or worse. And all the seed oils that are in processed foods and the omega-6s in conventional meat and dairy, that has all contributed to an imbalance in the average American's omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in the average American's diet. To about 10 to 20 to 1 omega-6s to omega-3s. The ancestral human diet, or a wild game diet, looking back in time, the balance is about 1 to 1. And when you think about initiating and quelling inflammation, you want a diet that has about a 1 to 1 to 4 to 1 balance of omega-6s to omega-3s to form a healthy diet. Today, we are literally kind of bathing ourselves dietarily in omega-6 fats, and that's probably one of the contributing causes to many of the chronic illnesses that affect so many of us that are rooted in inflammation. In terms of phytochemicals, there's also interesting connections to human health. The sources of phytochemicals, fruits and vegetables, meat and dairy to some extent, are sort of major sources of phytochemicals in the human diet. And the things that we eat go down the hatch. We eat them, they go through our digestive system, through our stomach, our small intestine, they land down here in the colon, where the human microbiome starts to digest them and transform them in much the same way that the microbiome in the rhizosphere serves as a transformative element for plants. The human microbiome does that in our gut. And it's another case of microbial metabolites benefiting the host organism, because it turns out that the human microbiome will take those phytochemicals that are embedded in the fiber that your doctor always tells you to eat, and they metabolize those phytochemicals. And there's documented literature in the medical literature of how those microbial metabolites then serve as in anti-cancer roles, anti-diabetic roles, anti-inflammation roles, support brain health, and support cardiac health. In other words, the balance that the phytochemicals in our diet are an integral part of our health plan, where if we get enough of them, they actually can help us quell many of the chronic illnesses that have increased so dramatically in the late 20th century as we took omega-3s and phytochemicals gradually out of our diet from our agricultural practices. So where does that sort of leave us? Well, the sort of bottom line message that Ann and I came up with in researching What Your Food Ate, and that really is a parallel track that's run right through the work of these 4 books, is that what's good for the land is good for us too. regenerative farming practices can not only help restore fertility to the world's farmland, which is increasingly important going forward, but it can also, we think, help to restore elements of the human diet that help to support our bodies to resist the kind of chronic illnesses that so increasingly plague us. Phytochemicals serve as antioxidant and anti-inflammatory capacities in the human body. Omega-3 fats have been identified in a whole lot of positive health benefits, ranging from helping to delay the onset of Alzheimer's and mental deterioration with age. And also helping to reduce and quell inflammation. So there's lots of connections there, lots of food for thought, if you'll pardon another pun. But the idea that farming practices are really an integral part of what sets up human health ought to lead us to start thinking about agricultural policies really as public health policies. So in terms of stories from the soil, there you have it. Dirt talks about the problem. The hidden half of nature goes into the science behind a potential cure. The growing revolution looks at how farmers are actually using these ideas around the world to rebuild healthy, fertile soils. And What Your Food Ate talks about, the importance to human health and the science that connects all those dots, leading from the soil right to our own bodies and our own health. So I will basically stop sharing my screen there, and I would be happy to engage in any questions that people have. And I think there's a little Q&A thing that I'd be happy to open up.
Thank you, David.
No worries.
Yeah, there's a few questions that have come in.
Yeah, well, there's 3 questions so far, so I think I can
Yeah.
probably handle trying to answer those.
Well, okay, you can see them. Well,
Okay, so
Ginny asks, are organic fertilizers part of regenerative farming?
that's a really interesting question. There's a lot of arguments now about what is and what is not regenerative farming, and it's not well defined in any area, although the regenerative organic program has defined it in a way where organic fertilizers are part of it. Some regenerative farmers are still using synthetic or chemical fertilizers, but they've so greatly cut down on the amount that they need to use that I started teasing some of them that I met that they were organic-ish farmers. And these are people who are never going to go organic for cultural reasons. But they almost weaned themselves off of, and in some cases completely weaned themselves off of chemical fertilizers. So organic fertilizers can be a part of regenerative farming, but whether they are depends a bit on whose definition of regenerative farming you actually embrace. The definition that I like is that regenerative farming is farming that prioritizes building soil health, and so that those 3 principles that I was identifying earlier of minimal disturbance, cover crops, and diversity are the key elements, and there's different ways to do that.
Thank you, thank you. Spence asks, if regenerative farming is better, how can we adjust what we buy at the grocery store and our diets to encourage the regenerative farming market?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you first what Ann and I have done in our own diet, and we've gone to completely 100% grass-fed meat and dairy when we eat meat and dairy, because that's a label you can actually find and that has meaning if it's 100% grass-fed. The just grass-fed label, there's some squishiness in terms of what those animals can sometimes get. That's come out in some studies. There are regenerative labels, the regenerative organic label that is out there now, that you can be confident that, yeah, it's following the kinds of principles that I was talking about. The other way that Ann and I have gone about it is to buy more of our food from farmers markets where we can actually meet the farmers that are growing it and ask them, what are you actually doing on your land? And then we would buy from those vendors that we like the practices that they have. It's a bit of an issue now in terms of if you walk into a grocery store, sort of what the different labels actually mean. In general, I would think that the regenerative, something labeled regenerative is going to be better than something that's not, but there are still sort of questions about, what is really allowed under that label since it's not really defined. The regenerative organic one has standards.
I have not seen those regenerative labels. What are you seeing those on meat or dairy products?
Oh, yeah, particularly on dairy, I've noticed them on yogurts and things. And so, I've started to see them over the last 6 months to a year. And some of them, some of them have real standards behind them. And the regenerative organic one is the one that I am familiar with that has, solid standards behind. Um, but even farmers who are sort of aware of the practices and principles, that's probably going to be better than ones that aren't. Um, Now the other thing that you can do in terms of a grocery store is you can start bugging the people who are working there about whether they are going to be carrying regenerative products. In the Seattle area, the PCC markets just had a big meeting to try and suss out what they were doing in terms of a strategy with that.
Excellent, excellent. Could you comment on the movement to create perennial grains commercially in the Midwest like they're doing at the Land Institute?
Yeah, I've been out to the Land Institute. West Jackson's got an amazing thing going there, and the basic idea of perennial grains is you grow grains that you don't have to plow up every year, so you can just like eliminate tillage because your plants are perennial. Um, and they have a crop called kernza that's essentially a perennial wheat grass. Um, I've had bread and beer and I think whiskey made from it that was all really good. The So it's a very solid movement. There's They've made great progress, and in the future I expect to see more and more of it because the best way to not disturb the soil, are perennial crops for sure. So I encourage people to check out the Land Institute if they're interested in this. They're a pretty amazing institution at this point, and they've branched out into other crops as well.
Are any of these products available commercially in the Pacific Northwest that you're aware of?
I don't know.
Me either, but it sounds interesting.
Yeah, and then I've had them. Not sure how broadly disseminated or distributed they are, but they're definitely they have crops that are producing and producing well.
Excellent. Carol asks, you didn't mention the
Ah,
benefits to biodiversity of wildlife as a benefit of regenerative ag. What are your thoughts on this and how it might help get support for ag policy changes?
one of the biggest differences I've noticed on regenerative farms and conventional farms is the amount of insect noise. Regenerative farms have life on them, and uh, and it's not life that's threatening the crops. It's basically a lot of insects that are eating the bugs that's not really a problem. So yes, there's a big biodiversity benefit, and it's not just above ground. There's a biodiversity in the soil as well. A lot of regenerative farmers note that how worms come back to their farms once they stop routinely tilling and fertilizing with ammonia or synthetic nitrogen. They get worms back, and the worms are great ecosystem engineers to help rebuild soil fertility. Um, the And so yes, and in terms of the Kaiser Singing Frogs farm, one of the things I noticed when I was there, sort of standing in their fields, is all around in the hedgerows around their farm, there's lots of birds. And the birds are there to eat the things that want to eat the crops, and so they're like little policemen that sort of go and clean up the bugs that the farmers don't want. The biodiversity angle is a good one, and I don't know if that many studies on it. Jonathan Lundgren at Blue Dasher Farm and the Ecdysis Foundation in South Dakota is probably the guy who's doing the most work on that. And his farm is just teeming with life, and it's very, very productive. So yes, Carol, that's a major connection there.
That sounds incredible. A question from Peggy. Any studies on the health and presence or lack of chronic disease in people who've been living on, working, and eating the products from regenerative farming?
I'm not aware of those studies. If anyone runs across them, feel free to please send me a link to them. I would like to see those kinds of studies. I can tell you that in my own health experience, I had some inflammatory issues that once I shifted from a diet, when I shifted to 100% grass-fed meat and dairy, um, sinus issues and some other chronic issues really cleaned up in a way that I was not expecting, and fairly dramatically. But I would like to see those kinds of the studies done.
Excellent. That was actually a question from Stephen, who is a medical doctor, but thank you.
Stephen, if you'd like to work on those kind of studies, I'd be happy to help you with it, but I've not seen them.
Okay. Shuju asks, how about perennial greens? I know there's a collard. How about others? Is there anything you're aware of?
Oh, I'm not much of a cook or a gardener or a farmer, to be frank. I'm a geologist, so I'm not gonna be much help on that one.
Okay.
If Anne was here, she would give you a very good, sound set of advice on that.
Well, back to Anne. You've discussed at the beginning how she, and perhaps with your help, transformed your yard, and by adding organic material and wood chips and other things. Any other hints you have that home gardeners might practice to move themselves toward regenerative practices as efficiently as possible?
Well, I was impressed with how well it worked for all of Anne's composting and mulching to not really dig it into the soil. She didn't do much in the way of disturbing the soil. She let soil life do the disturbing, and that was that was great. Saved us a lot of work. But I was impressed by how well that worked. She was very deliberate about making very diverse mixes of mulches when she was making her mulches. She would mix all kinds of stuff together, and so I would sing the praises of diversity in terms of what one was putting into mulches, um, and yeah, I was just very impressed with how fast that can actually bring fertility back to the land.
That's very encouraging. We've got
And,
it.
and we never used any chemical fertilizers on the yard at all, and we just had an explosion of biota.
Yeah, your pictures look beautiful. Well, did get a response to your question to have Dr. Steve Aguilu love to work with you. So I'll
Oh, well, Dr.
encourage
Steve,
them to contact you through your website, or what would
yeah,
be a good way to contact you?
feel free to contact me either through our website, www.dig2grow.com, dig, the number 2grow.com, which is, where we describe our books, or you can reach me through the University of Washington. I'm the only David Montgomery at the University of Washington, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Ah, someone asks, you mentioned hedgerows on regenerative farms, something that seems to have diminished with the consolidation of land into corporate mega farms. Are hedgerows key to regenerative ag?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of the hedgerows I've seen on regenerative farms are either in England or in Northern California. The ones in the Midwest, not so much. Should they be? Yes. A lot of the hedgerows were eliminated when we went to very large mechanized machinery. And so I've seen more of them preserved on small farms, and just the edge effects on small farms. But I think that the hedgerows and pollinator strips and sort of areas like that on farms are really useful, not only for promoting biodiversity, but for pest control as well. Having habitat for the things that eat your pests is a really good strategy for not needing to buy much in the way of pesticide.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. Any comments on comparing, contrasting regenerative farming from biodynamic farming?
Sure. I would consider biodynamic farming a subset of regenerative farming. In other words, I tend to think of regenerative farming as an umbrella of farming practices that build soil health as a consequence of farming. And biodynamic farming is a style of farming that builds soil health as a consequence of farming. Now, biodynamic has its own philosophy and its own sort of prescriptions and practices. Many of those turn out to, I think, actively support and cultivate the beneficial life in the soil. And I don't actually buy much of the philosophy behind biodynamic farming in terms of how was originally espoused, but I've been very impressed with the results that it can produce in terms of building soil health. So I would consider biodynamic farming a type of regenerative farming that is distinct. And there's a number of studies that have looked at the sort of soil microbiota and the kinds of phytochemicals that are produced on biodynamic farms, and they're distinctly different than other styles of farming. So But it's a style of farming that it definitely is tailored towards building soil health. And so I would call it a style of regenerative farming.
Makes sense. Well, you have answered every question that's been posed and more. And I appreciate your time. Let's see, perhaps we can get ready to sign off and give you a chance to go eat some dinner.
All right. Well, I appreciate the interest and the attention. Obviously, encourage people, if you're interested in this stuff, check out the books. The nice thing about writing it all down is I don't have to remember it. It's all sort of in there somewhere. And I tried to give you the executive summary view through it. But there's, the connections between how we treat the land and how then our food treats us. I think they're real. And I think they're very interesting. And I think we're only starting to really appreciate the magnitude of those connections. I appreciate the attention that you guys are paying and letting me wax forth on it.
Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your scholarship with us. Good
No
night,
worries.
everyone.
Take care.
All right.